Hey guys, so in this video I'm going to cover one of the most highly requested topics I've seen in the comments section, surviving the early game in Arena. I know a lot of you guys said you want background gameplay without the face cam, and going forward that's how it'll be, but every once in a while I want to mix it up and just throw in a face cam for those that like it. It also works for this video specifically because the gameplay you're watching isn't the usual one full game where I get a win at the end. It's going to be me playing out the early game of different Champion League arena matches. Literally just early game fights, loot paths, rotations, and other stuff strictly from the early game. So don't be confused if you see me wearing like 5 or 6 different skins because they're all from different games. This video will be geared more towards arena and tournament matches just because those are the dedicated competitive game modes, but all the tips and tricks I give will also apply and be pretty helpful in normal public matches. I'll define the early game as the moment you jump out of the battle bus until the first circle closes in. The reason the early game is often the hardest part of a match is simply because it's full of the most RNG. You don't know what weapons you'll get from chests, how many people will land with you, where they'll actually land, what loot they get, and if they'll land before you do. I get countless comments asking for tips to make it to endgame because, in all honesty, the mid and late game really aren't too bad if you practice zone wars and rotations. The early game is a complete different beast though, and hopefully by the end of this video you'll feel a lot more confident going into each match and surviving past the first zone. Since the early game has a few different parts to it, I'll put some timestamps on the screen now for when I cover each specific section. But if you are struggling with the early game, I highly recommend watching the whole video through. With that said, let's start with one of the most overlooked aspects of mastering the early game, choosing your drop spot. I think most of you guys know the best way to consistently make it out of the early game is to have one landing spot and stick with it. If you're good enough, you could definitely get away with dropping at a hot spot or anywhere near the start of the battle bus path, but you probably wouldn't be watching this video if that's the case. The hard part for a lot of you guys will be actually deciding upon your landing spot. There are tons of videos online, including one that I made, with good drop spots for solos and duos. In reality though, everywhere and anywhere is viable. This map shows where every solo World Cup qualifier dropped, just proves it. You could land on ballers and then loot unnamed spots. You could drop at larger POIs and fight for better loot. Or you can play it safe and land as far as you can from the rest of the lobby. There are 3 things I believe you should be looking for in a good landing spot. 1. Good materials. 2. Good loot. And 3. Good rotations. Usually, places that have all 3 of these things will be contested, so it's up to you to decide what you value in a drop spot. One cool website that I found is called lootlake.info, and it literally shows you everything that's available around every part of the map. I've been landing Pressure Plant recently, as you can see from the gameplay, but just a quick glance at the map shows how many different chests it has and exactly where each of them is located. You can also see where vending machines, slipstreams, sky platforms, cannons, volcano vents, mushrooms, and basically everything else you could possibly be interested are. Again though, you can make any landing spot work. Don't land somewhere just because you see your favorite streamer does. Pick one spot and stick with it. The next thing I would do after finding a good landing spot is just hop into playgrounds and learn everything about the location. See exactly where every chest is, how you can access each of them, all the floor loot spawns, ammo boxes, what materials are there, and then how you can rotate out of it for the first zone. You really just want to get to know your drop spot and learn all the ins and outs of it. Somewhere like Happy Hamlet, for example, has the weird angled roofs that you'll have trouble building on. After you explore your spot, go into normal public matches and drop there and see how and where fights usually take place. Because each POI has such a distinct layout, you should quickly notice where most of the fights in your landing spot break out at. Fights at Salty are almost always near the big blue house or the brick house at the opposite side because that's where you'll have players from other houses rotating towards after they loot their own. You can also watch pro players who drop at your spot and pick up on the little things that they do that you aren't doing. When I used to land at Lucky Landing and loot the back building, I would be really scared I'd get shot at because of how exposed I was while opening ammo boxes and chests. Then one day I was watching Bugha and I noticed that he would double rotate his ramps and place them backwards in front of the big windows so he's basically protected while looting. Tricks as simple as that could be huge in helping you survive the early game and are things that you might not pick up yourself. Now, after all of this, you're probably about ready to bring your drop spot into Arena. The second and arguably the most important step of surviving the early game, given that you've already decided upon a landing location, is to choose exactly where you're going to drop within your landing spot and then master your drop from the battle bus. If you have a better drop than everyone else landing at your spot, and you're landing at the best building with the most loot, you're going to be at a huge advantage compared to those other guys. Something I've noticed from watching players who qualified for the World Cup in New York is that their drops are always ridiculously good and that they're always dropping at the same exact spot. And by the same exact spot, I mean the same exact floor loot spawn in the same building or the same room in the same house every game they possibly can. The reason for this is pretty simple. Most POIs and places on the map have an optimal spot to land at, and those optimal spots to land at have optimal drops from the battle bus to get there. A really good example of this is Westworld, where Tfue used to land. There's a ton of buildings and places to land within it, but the most optimal building to land at is the big yellow one at the center. It's the most optimal because it has more chests and floor loot than any other building, and it's also the tallest building. So right after Tfue would loot it, he would go up and build on it and have high ground over everyone else who landed there. From there, he can decide what he wants to do, who he wants to fight, and can overall just make more informed decisions based on everything that he sees. If you've ever watched Tfue land at the yellow building, you'll notice he's almost always the first one there because of how good his drop is from the battle bus. Keyword here is almost always. The first thing you should do is figure out what's the most optimal building at your drop spot. It's usually the building with the most chest spawns, like the big house at Fatal Fields, the big blue house at Salty, or the hotel at Paradise. If it's not the place with the most chests, then it might be the best position within the POI. At Lucky Landing, it's always best to land at the back buildings because you don't have to worry about anyone pushing you from the side or behind you. If you land at the front buildings instead, you're going to get pushed by people who land at the bridge, people who land at the temple right outside of it, and of course whoever lands at the back houses. Do your best to figure out where the optimal landing spot is within your drop spot, and then your next step will be getting there before anyone else. The best and fastest way to master your drop is to go into a public match and drop while aiming for the optimal house or building. Mark wherever you pull your chute after dropping from the battle bus. This way, no matter what the bus route is, you'll know where the lowest point in your drop should be. Then go onto Google, download the Fortnite Battle Royale map, and throw it in paint. Zoom in on your drop spot and circle wherever you figure out the point is where you should pull your glider. To show you guys what I mean, I just did 2 test drops and drew where they were, but to really master the early game, you should do it from every single angle, so it should look something like this, where it's a large circle of circles around your drop spot. Some tips for dropping are simple things you might already know, like dropping straight down is faster than dropping at an angle, and that the lower the elevation of the map, the lower you can go down before you're forced to pull your glider. So if I land over the lava by pressure plant, I can drop much lower and faster before pulling my chute than if I was dropping over the volcano, and that's just because of how high up the volcano is in the air. In arena and tournament matches, a majority of the early game comes down to whoever has the best drop at the best building in your drop spot. If you're still dying in fights, then you have to work on box fighting or your mechanics like building and editing. Or if you're dying because you're making bonehead plays, that's a game sense problem that you need to work on. The things you can control are where you drop and if you're the first one there. My other tips for the early game are more general things for after you land. Always try to utilize whatever loot you get to the best of your ability. If you find grenades, use them to pressure whoever is around you. And if you get minis, use them before you go out and fight. In the early game, the most important thing is hitting your shots and your aim, so definitely go Kovacs and make sure your aim is on point if you expect to live and do well. Because you don't have much materials and stuff like that, you don't really have to worry that much about building and editing. Aiming is much more important in the early game. Also, try to only take smart fights unless you have no other choice and some maniac is pushing you or 50-50s you for a chest. If the RNG gods bless you with a combat shotgun off spawn, then it might be a smart idea to fight, just because based on sheer numbers, there's a high chance whoever landed around you doesn't have one. The best pro players I watch usually wait to find some sort of shield and a shotgun, preferably a combat, before they feel comfortable pushing opponents in the early game. It's also okay to play it slow and safe and avoid everyone. You don't need to fight people, but don't be scared if you're full shield with a gold combat shotgun. Always push your advantage, and like I said before, make the most out of the loadout you're given. Most early game fights will come down to box fighting, so work on that, look at my tips and tricks, and just practice 1v1ing your friends in box fights. The last thing you want to do after you win an early game fight, or you just get lucky and you loot up in peace, is to rotate out. Hopefully you picked a spot with a lot of rotating devices nearby, like ballers or slipstreams or geysers, because then it should be pretty easy and straightforward to rotate out to zone. If you're forced to rotate on foot, make sure you know what other landing spots could have people at them nearby. This way you won't be surprised if you see someone rotating with you. I always aim to rotate to the center of the map, so take whatever geyser or slipstream station you have nearby and go deep into the center of zone. That way you'll be much closer to the second zone. Overall though, the early game is not as scary as it seems. The majority of it comes down to figuring out where to drop, what house they're building to drop at, being the first one there, and then playing safe and smart. If you're still struggling with early game fights due to RNG, try landing at tilted and pubs to practice early game engagements and fights with bad loot. Hopefully you guys learned something and RNG will be in your favor. So if you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and to turn on post notifications. Thank you to everyone who's using code Jarian. The Ducky12 mini giveaway ends in 2 days, boys. This is your last chance to enter, so go to my Twitter now. Otherwise, that's it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.